Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. A year into President Trump's second term, the global trade order has been upended. Tariffs have returned as Washington's weapon of choice, targeting rivals like China, allies like Korea and Europe, even reshaping supply chains across North America. Korea is facing renewed pressure, with tariffs already hitting steel and appliances and semiconductors now in the crosshairs. Meanwhile, Trump's push to assert U.S. control over Greenland has opened a new transatlantic front with retaliatory tariffs against NATO allies. Trade, once a matter of economics, is now entangled with defense and diplomacy, raising urgent questions about what comes next. For a deeper analysis into the current situation, we are joined by Jun-sok, professor of economics at the Catholic University of Korea, here in the studio with us. A big welcome.
Happy to be here.
And also joining us online is Hwa-kyun Kim, professor of banking and finance at Texas A&M University Mays Business School. Good to see you.
Good to see you again.
So let's start a discussion with Professor Young. Like I've said, President Trump's second term, it's marked with a clear departure from the traditional global free trade order. I wonder, how would you characterize the changes that have emerged?
Okay, well, the multilateral trading system has considerably weakened, perhaps beyond its breaking point. The United States has opted out of the multilateral system effectively. They haven't said anything explicitly, but I don't think they're paying any attention to WTO or the Uruguay round agreements. And even with the FTAs, they seem to be implementing them inconsistently. Now, U.S. is allowing some Canadian and Mexican goods to come into the U.S. under the USMCA rules, but President Trump keeps on threatening Mexico and Canada with additional tariffs. Some of the tariffs that he imposed on Canada and Mexico are questionable under the current USMCA rules, and I believe USMCA is going through a review this year, and no one's really sure whether President Trump will continue with the USMCA or will declare that he is going to withdraw from USMCA. Now, I was hoping when President Trump announced the reciprocal tariffs last year that perhaps some country or region like the European Union would take up the mantle of maintaining free trade. But they have not done so. But recently, the attempts to perhaps increase FTAs without including the United States may have accelerated. Canada has recently signed trade agreement with China, basically dealing with agricultural goods and electric vehicles. It is reported that EU is very close to signing the trade agreement with India, and European Union has signed a trade agreement with Mercosur countries, which include Argentina and Brazil. So there is some hope for free trade, but perhaps not multilateral free trade.
Right, so a lot of things have changed, causing countries to have their own free trades too. But when we look a closer look at the North America, the shift actually becomes more visible. Trump's first major tariff moves targeted Mexico and Canada, as many of us are aware of. So in his second term, Professor Kim, how has the U.S. approach to its North American trade partners shifted, and what impact is that having on regional supply chains and trade dynamics?
Yeah, so I think, as Professor Young mentioned, the zooming in on North American, the second term obviously has turned the region into both a shelter and a pressure cooker for trade. So some uncertainty exists and actually is escalating. So on one hand, obviously, the big shift is that the tariffs on Mexico and Canada are no longer a temporary bargaining chip. They've become like a standing policy instrument with uncertainty, obviously, and risk tied to, obviously, non-trade goals such as migration, border security, and some of the other issues such as drug flows and stuff like that. So in early 2025, the 25% tariffs on imports from Mexico and Canada were announced, and then I think we still don't know what's going to happen. I mean, the USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, still there, but it's going to be under review, and we don't know what's going to be the exact output. So depending on the progress, it's going to have like very different actually the policy implications. So like on one hand, we see this the punitive tariffs and the threats of this across the border duties on Mexico and Canada raise the cost obviously of intra-regional trade and very, very complicate just-in-time logistics. So supply chain is going to be massively scrambled, and the firms have had to build more inventory or some redundancy in suppliers, and which actually add up cost. So it's going to have issues in terms of like the firm's flexibility of planning and also like production. But at the same time, when we look at like the lens beyond the North America, then same U.S. tariffs on China and other countries probably are encouraging companies still to keep as much of their production footprint as possible within the USMCA zone. So on this second tax, still despite this, the issues, maybe firms actually will still try to just produce and maintain the headquarters, the local headquarters, I think, in Mexico and Canada. I think I saw some articles that Mexico has benefited, in fact, after the tariff imposed on other countries. So overall, I think it's going to be more like the big uncertainty between these two types of the tax.
Mm-hmm. Now that you've mentioned China it's at the center of this trade dynamics. So with Trump's rhetoric heating up again and tariff tools being reactivated, where does the U.S.-China trade war currently stand, and how is it evolving differently in this second term of President Trump?
I think that's a very important question. So the first term is more like very punitive measures, like a tariffs is going to be something that China is going to be the bearing because of all this, the sort of like unfair trade rules and practices that China has been doing, and also all this kind of like the massive dominance of the cheap products, especially foraying into the U.S. But then I think second term seems to be, I can see that slight changes in nuance, and I think it is more like, the strategic tools. So from like unfair trade sort of like, the argument to the strategic rivalry. So I think I can kind of see from President Trump, Trump's the sort of like statements that China is going to be a big rival. Therefore, we're going to use the tariff and other tools as a strategic, the basically tool, and then I think we will continue to do that. So it's more like a always on, and the uncertainty itself is going to be another tool. So basically tariff is used to be more like once it's set, then for the time being it was like stable, but now it's actually having its own growth rate, and also the announcement it has as expectation effects, therefore virtually a risk and uncertainty. So I think this one itself is also being used. So the relationship itself becomes very unstable, and also as a kind of big rival sort of situation. The whole trade, the part is going to be used as to just cope with this type of situation.
Right. So tariffs itself actually could mean more recently than what we've used to know before. Now, let's shift a little bit to Korea's position right now, Professor Young. Korea has already been hit with high tariffs on items like steel. We're aware of that. But how would you assess the impact of these already imposed tariffs over the past year? Okay,
well, last year I think Korea was very lucky. Korea actually exports went up to historically high levels. Korea's exports last year was $709.7 billion. It was up 3.8% from 2024, and that was because of a mixture of very lucky factors. Now, first, there were rise in the exports of semiconductors toward the second half of the year, and that's mostly because U.S. started building a lot of AI data centers, and that just increased the demand for Korean semiconductors. And semiconductors still hasn't been hit with a tariff yet. President Trump just a few days ago hinted that he might impose semiconductor tariffs, and he did impose semiconductor tariffs on items that were re-exported from the United States. Now, Korea was also lucky in that there was a lot of hoarding by U.S. importers because they wanted to import Korean products before the tariffs hit. And Korea was also lucky in that exports to South Asian countries, especially Vietnam, went up. So we did have a historically high export last year, but will it be repeated this year? I think it'll be very difficult. First of all, we don't know if the increased demand for semiconductors will continue. And secondly, I don't think there will be as much hoarding this year because everybody now knows that Korea will have 15% tariffs. And it's questionable whether the increased exports to Asian regions will continue this year. If we compare 2024 to 2026, we definitely have a lot more barriers to trade in 2026.
Mm-hmm. So our companies also had a lot of actions towards that. We've seen Korean conglomerates take some bold steps. Hyundai and Samsung semiconductor expansion in the U.S. are prime examples, of course. So, Professor Kim, do you think these investment-driven strategies are really effective as a long-term buffer for this?
In the shorter, the medium term, it depends on how long is medium term, but I think that these moves are clearly effective, I guess, by putting, for instance, steel in the grounds in the US. I think the Korean firms turns themselves from like foreign exporters into major local employers and political stakeholders, especially with lobbying and everything. So that changes obviously the dynamics and calculus in Washington, and therefore it's going to be useful. Whether this is going to be super effective in the long term, that's another story, as we somewhat learn from China, because we have built a lot of factories and branches in China, and then it was actually a big profit-making machine. I think that helped a lot, I think, in terms of the Korea's actually exporting goods against China, and also, I think, increased the GDP, etc. But when the Chinese actually political risk actually escalated, then I think that actually became an issue. So it's going to be a great thing because it's becoming a local player, but at the same time, it actually means there's some possibility that it could be a hostage in certain cases. So obviously, in the long term, basically, the Korea also has to diversify its the production and the logistics, actually, the centers. And also, I think, if it's possible, even if the labor cost is a bit high, maybe the firms can reduce a bit with the AI and robots in the long term, has to actually, the remain in Korea for production as well, at least a certain percentage.
Mm-hmm. But even so, there's still concerns because President Trump, apparently, he signaled some possible new tariffs on semiconductors, a category that has remained untouched right now. So if this will be imposed, then Professor Young, how disruptive would it be?
Okay, I think right now, the United States has announced two measures on semiconductors. The first has to do with re-export. So when it's mostly aimed at NVIDIA and AMD, Taiwanese companies. If they export to the United States and that exported semiconductors is re-exported to China, then United States will collect tariffs on that exports to the United States. And this was actually a part of the deal that was made between NVIDIA, AMD, and the United States. Because the United States said that the NVIDIA and AMD can export AI chips to China, but they wanted something out of it. So Taiwan companies cannot export directly to China. It has to go through the United States, and United States will collect tariffs from it. And then secondly, the U.S.-Taiwanese trade agreement that was recently signed, it limits the tariff-free exports to the United States to a certain percentage of the production capacity that Taiwanese companies build in the United States. And this kind of condition may be imposed on Korea as well. There's a lot of details that wasn't worked out between Korea and the United States. And this type of capacity limits may be part of the negotiation in the next few weeks.
Mm-hmm. But Professor Young, as many of us are aware of, President Trump's renewed push to claim Greenland and decision to impose retaliatory tariffs on 8 European countries that opposed it, it's really the hot potato these days. So do you see this leading to a possible, full-blown transatlantic trade war?
I think the European Union was trying to avoid it, but it may not be avoidable. And that's because when Trump said that he will impose tariffs on 8 countries, you cannot really impose tariffs on a subset of European Union countries. You have to, because they are an economic union, you're basically imposing tariffs on all of them. And if it was just Greenland, and if Trump promised that he would negotiate with Denmark, maybe they could have avoided the trade war. But the United States, President Trump has recently announced that he may seek 200% tariffs on French champagne and wine because France will not join his Board of Peace. And if you start using tariff policies, poking the beast, if you will, then the European Union may not have a choice but to retaliate and effectively have a trade war.
Mm-hmm. So it's very concerning. It's really going beyond just trade. And what stood out in the Greenland fallout is that 8 countries Trump targeted with tariffs are all NATO allies. Professor Kim, do you think this marks a turning point where the U.S. is using trade as leverage, not just economically, but in matters of defense and diplomacy as well?
I think so. Historically, the U.S. has certainly used economic pressure on allies, like over defense spending as we actually pay, or sanctions in terms of like compliance. But it tended to rely on behind-the-scenes type of diplomacy rather than this type of explicit ones. Now, I think we can see it's very visible, and it weaponizes everyday trade flows, and also it sort of like gives certain the threat in some sense. So it looks like trade is no longer just a tool for extracting some economic concessions or like some form of like a light sales tax, but rather this is going to be become a lever, I think, in broader bargaining game over defense commitments, and especially now that like the China is becoming a kind of credible threat to like the U.S. security and also the economic system. Clearly, the U.S. is going to become more protectionist, actually, in some sense, and also use everything of these kind of things, even with the strongest allies, such as in EU or even like Japan and Korea. So I think that's what it is.
Mm-hmm. So it's definitely a huge shift, allies being treated like adversaries economically and strategically, both. But so now with the situation, Professor Young, when we look ahead, how long do you think will this tariff war would continue?
Okay, well, the first possible barrier is going to come up perhaps in even as early as tomorrow, but probably in the next few weeks, which is the Supreme Court ruling on the constitutionality of Trump's tariffs, or at least part of it, the reciprocal tariff part of the trade. But no one knows when that ruling will come out. It may come out as early as tomorrow, or it may take about June. And then the second possible barrier that may come up is the November elections. Trump will not be up for re-election, but the Congress will. And if the Republicans have a large loss, then I think the Democrats, as well as the Republicans, see that this is very unpopular with the American population, and they may try to rein in President Trump. But we'll have to wait and see what happens. It may just be that the Supreme Court allows the tariff, and the Republicans may actually win the midterms.
Then what would happen to, the global trade order?
Well, it'll be chaotic, and perhaps even more chaotic because Trump will be more enabled because he passed the midterm with American support. So we will probably see the tariff being used more, even more often, even more strongly. President Trump already looks at tariff as sort of a Swiss Army knife of foreign policy, tried to do everything with it. And he may become emboldened if he wins the Supreme Court ruling and the midterm elections. So we may be in for a more rough environment. And I think the case that we saw with Greenland and France is saying that he will not necessarily keep to the agreement that he has made already. So we may have constant surprises on tariff rates.
Oh, that's very concerning to hear, but we'll have to keep close tabs on the latest developments. Thank you so much for your insights tonight, Professor Yang.
Thank you.
And of course, Professor Kim, we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.